11 men ran. Not gradually. Not after thinking it over. The moment the torches appeared at the entrance of the garden, they ran. All of them. No exceptions. Peter, James, John. The ones who watched Lazarus walk out of a tomb. The ones who handed out bread to 5,000 people. All of them ran. But there is one different record. A single verse that changes everything. What this video is going to answer is, why? What did John know that the other 11 had never internalized? Jesus was not subtle. He was not vague. He said it explicitly, repeatedly, in 3 different Gospels. Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Matthew 16 verse 6. And the moment Jesus says this, the disciples are in a boat with him. 1 loaf of bread for all of them. Jesus says watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees. And they turn to each other and conclude he must be upset about the bread situation. Jesus had multiplied 5 loaves to feed 5,000 people, with 12 baskets left over. And then did it again, 7 loaves for 4,000. And they are worried about lunch. The leaven was working. And they hadn't noticed. Because leaven never feels like leaven from the inside. From the inside it feels like ambition. It feels like caring about the mission. It feels legitimate. John was in the same room. He heard the same teachings. He watched the same miracles. He was in the same boat when Jesus gave the warning. But John had a different orientation. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. John 13 verse 23. Same room. Same meal. Same night the others were arguing about greatness. But John was listening differently. John wasn't just hearing Jesus' teachings about the Pharisees. He was processing the diagnosis. You are of your father the devil. He is a liar and the father of lies. John 8 verse 44. That is not an emotional outburst. That is a clinical diagnosis. Jesus was identifying the root of the system, not just the symptoms. And John was the only one who recorded that exchange with that depth. John understood the mechanism of power. How that system kept people trapped. Through the glory that comes from men. Through the fear of exclusion. What separated John from the others wasn't access to Jesus' words. It was what he did with them. The others admired the teachings. John was building a framework of understanding from them. There were 3 layers working against the disciples simultaneously. First, they were watching for the wrong kind of threat. The disciples expected opposition to look like opposition. Armies. Arrest warrants. But Jesus didn't warn them about a sword. He warned them about leaven. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? 1 Corinthians 5 verse 6. Leaven doesn't announce what it's doing. It works slowly from the inside. And by the time you notice, the transformation is already complete. The disciples were scanning the horizon for an army. The leaven was already in the kitchen. Second layer, proximity to Jesus made them feel immune. They were with him. They had seen the miracles. But Jesus never said closeness to him was a substitute for understanding his words. You can be in the same boat as Jesus and still completely miss what he's telling you. Third layer, the most unsettling. The leaven had already gotten in. Position. Title. Who's first? Who's most important? That's not fisherman's thinking. That's Pharisaical thinking wearing a different coat. The obsession with status that Jesus had been dismantling in Matthew 23 had found its way into the inner circle. And nobody had noticed. Everything Jesus had warned about arrives at once, not gradually. The plan the Pharisees had been constructing executes in a single night with terrifying precision. Judas came to the garden guiding a detachment of soldiers and officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. John 18 verse 3. And leading them, someone who had been sitting at the Last Supper table hours earlier. The corruption Jesus diagnosed. The hypocrisy he named. The leaven he warned about in the boat. It all arrives at the garden at once. Organized. Armed. Coming for him. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Matthew 26 verse 56. They didn't fall to the Pharisees militarily. They fell psychologically. They had no framework for what was happening. Not because Jesus hadn't given them one, but because they had never fully believed they would need it. And then came the servant girl. One simple question. 3 denials. The man who made the boldest declaration of loyalty could not survive a single servant girl asking if he knew Jesus. There is one disciple who doesn't run. One who makes his way to the place where the thing Jesus warned about is fully executing. John was there. At the cross. Close enough for Jesus to speak to him in his final moments. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. John 19 verse 26. The difference between John and the others was not courage under pressure. You don't manufacture that kind of steadiness in a crisis moment. It was built before the crisis. The difference was comprehension. John already knew what he was looking at. Acts 5. The same disciples who couldn't hold their ground when a servant girl recognized Peter's face are now standing in front of the full Sanhedrin. The same council that orchestrated the crucifixion of Jesus. We must obey God rather than human beings. Acts 5 verse 29. Same man. Same voice. Completely different posture. What changed was not his personality. What changed was comprehension. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. Luke 24 verse 45. When they saw the courage of Peter and John, they took note that these men had been with Jesus. Acts 4 verse 13. The council that scattered them in a garden is now recognizing the presence of Jesus in the very men they thought they had broken. The Pharisees are gone. The Sanhedrin dissolved. The temple fell in 70 AD, exactly as Jesus predicted. Not one stone left on another. That particular expression of religious power was finished. But the leaven isn't gone. Having a form of godliness but denying its power. 2 Timothy 3 verse 5. Same leaven. Different century. Different faces. The corruption that enters when external religious performance replaces internal transformation. When titles replace character. When the outside of the cup becomes the priority while the inside fills with something else entirely. Watch out that no one deceives you. Matthew 24 verse 4. Not armies. Not persecution. Deception. That's what he leads with. Because that's what he's always considered the primary danger. Not the obvious threat, the subtle one. Not the sword. The leaven. 11 men ran because they heard without understanding. John stayed because he understood what he was seeing. The difference wasn't built in the garden. It was built over 3 years of paying close attention to what Jesus was actually saying. Not just admiring the words, but building a framework of understanding from them. The question this leaves us with is not whether you would have stayed in the garden. The question is, what posture do you bring to Jesus' warnings right now? Are you in John's position, processing, internalizing, building comprehension? Or are you in the position of the other 11, hearing, agreeing, and going back to thinking about bread? The warning hasn't changed. The mechanism hasn't changed. And the cost of not believing it hasn't changed either. You don't have to wait for the garden. You don't have to wait for the rooster. The warning is already on record. The only question left is whether you're going to believe it.